Yorkville, Illinois, June 1986. The smell of chlorinated pool water and sunscreen hung thick in the afternoon air as 17-year-old Laura Jensen adjusted the straps of her lifeguard chair at the Yorkville community pool. The Midwest summer had arrived early that year, bringing with it the familiar rhythm of teenage life in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Laura's blonde hair caught the light as she scanned the pool deck, her whistle hanging around her neck like a badge of temporary authority. She had graduated from Yorkville High just 2 weeks earlier, walking across the same stage where her older brother had received his diploma 3 years before. The town's graduation ceremony was always held in the school gymnasium, with families packed into bleachers that creaked under the weight of 3 generations celebrating together. Laura's parents, Jim and Carol Jensen, had sat in the third row, her mother clutching a disposable camera to capture every moment. Laura's got her whole life ahead of her, Carol would tell neighbors at the Piggly Wiggly grocery store. She's thinking about studying education at Northern Illinois University in the fall, wants to teach elementary school, just like her aunt did. The Jensen family lived in a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, with a front porch that faced the town's main drag and a backyard that bordered the cornfields stretching toward the Fox River. Jim worked at the Caterpillar plant in nearby Aurora, making the 40-minute drive each morning in his blue Ford pickup. Carol managed the front desk at Dr. Patterson's dental office, a job that kept her connected to the pulse of small-town gossip and community events. That summer of 1986, Yorkville felt suspended between its agricultural past and an uncertain future. The town's population hovered just under 7,000, with Main Street still anchored by family-owned businesses. Henderson's Hardware, where you could buy everything from fishing line to roofing nails, Mabel's Diner, where the coffee was always fresh and the pie recipes had been passed down through 3 generations, and the Regal Cinema, a single-screen theater that showed movies 3 months after they premiered in Chicago. Laura moved through this world with the easy confidence of someone who had never known anywhere else. She worked her lifeguard shifts 3 days a week, spending her off days at the lake with friends or helping her mother tend to the vegetable garden behind their house. She drove a used Honda Civic that her father had bought from a co-worker, painted a faded blue that she claimed matched her eyes. The last week of June brought an unusual heat wave, with temperatures climbing into the mid-90s and humidity that made the air feel thick as soup. Laura had been looking forward to the upcoming 4th of July weekend, when the whole town would gather at Hoover Forest Preserve for the annual fireworks display. She had plans to work the morning shift at the pool, then meet friends for a bonfire at the lake. On Friday, June 27th, Laura finished her shift at the community pool and headed home to shower and change clothes. Her younger sister, Amy, was in the kitchen making a sandwich when Laura came downstairs wearing cut-off jeans and a Yorkville High t-shirt. "Mom said you're going to the lake tonight," Amy said, not looking up from spreading peanut butter on white bread. "Just for a few hours," Laura replied, grabbing her car keys from the hook by the back door. "Tell them I'll be home by midnight." Those would be the last words Laura Jensen spoke to anyone in her family. The bonfire at Silver Lake had been organized by Rick Morrison, a recent graduate whose parents owned a small cottage on the North Shore. About a dozen teenagers gathered that evening, sitting on logs arranged in a circle around the fire, sharing stories and passing around cans of Coca-Cola that Rick had brought in a cooler filled with ice from the local gas station. Laura arrived around 8 o'clock, parking her Honda next to the other cars along the narrow dirt road that led to the lake access. The sun was beginning to set behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the water. She waved to friends as she approached the group, settling onto a log between her best friend, Jennifer Walsh, and a boy named Tommy Burke, who had been in her chemistry class. Laura seemed perfectly normal that night, Jennifer would later tell investigators. She was laughing, joking around, just being herself. "We were talking about plans for the summer, maybe taking a trip to Wisconsin Dells before college started." As the evening wore on, someone produced a camera, an old 35mm model that belonged to Rick's older brother. The group took turns posing for photos, mugging for the camera in the flickering light of the bonfire. Laura participated in several shots, her arm around Jennifer's shoulders, her smile bright and unguarded. Around 10:30, Laura stood up and announced she was heading home. She hugged Jennifer goodbye and walked toward the parking area, her car keys jingling in her hand. Several people called out goodbyes, their voices carrying across the still night air. But Laura Jensen never made it home that night. Her blue Honda Civic was found the next morning in the parking lot of Henderson's Hardware on Main Street, the doors unlocked and her purse sitting on the passenger seat. Her lifeguard whistle lay on the dashboard, catching the early morning sunlight like a small beacon that no one had heard. Yorkville, Illinois, summer 1986. Carol Jensen stood in her kitchen on Saturday morning, June 28th, staring at the telephone mounted on the wall next to the refrigerator. Laura's bed hadn't been slept in, and her curfew had passed 8 hours ago. The coffee in Carol's cup had grown cold as she debated whether to call the police or wait a little longer. In small towns like Yorkville, teenagers sometimes bent the rules, and parents often gave them the benefit of the doubt. But Laura had never stayed out all night without calling. Jim Jensen was in the garage, tinkering with the lawnmower engine, when Carol finally made the decision. Her hands shook slightly as she dialed the number for the Kendall County Sheriff's Department. The dispatcher, a woman named Helen Kowalski, who had lived in Yorkville for 30 years, took down the information with the practiced efficiency of someone who had fielded hundreds of similar calls over the years. "Most of these kids turn up by dinner time," Helen assured Carol. "They lose track of time, or they're embarrassed about something. Give it until this evening, and then call us back if you haven't heard anything." By Sunday morning, the Jensen family's concern had crystallized into genuine fear. Jim drove through every street in Yorkville, checking parking lots, asking neighbors if they had seen Laura's car. Carol called Jennifer Walsh, who confirmed that Laura had left the bonfire around 10:30 on Friday night, saying she was going straight home. Detective Ron Sawyer of the Kendall County Sheriff's Department officially opened a missing person case on Monday, July 1st. Sawyer was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, a methodical man who approached investigations with the patience of someone who understood that most mysteries had simple explanations. He interviewed the teenagers who had attended the bonfire, mapped out Laura's likely route home, and organized search teams to comb the area around Silver Lake. "In my experience, missing teenagers fall into 3 categories," Sawyer explained to the Jensen family during their first formal interview. "They're runaways who left voluntarily, they're victims of accidents, or they're victims of foul play. We investigate all 3 possibilities simultaneously." The search for Laura Jensen mobilized the entire community of Yorkville. Volunteers gathered at the fire station each morning, receiving assignments to search specific areas: the cornfields along County Road 47, the banks of the Fox River, the abandoned grain elevator on the outskirts of town. Local businesses donated food and water for the search teams. The high school principal, Margaret Ellis, opened the building during summer break to serve as a coordination center. Jennifer Walsh organized Laura's friends into their own search group, focusing on places that only teenagers would know: the old railroad bridge, where kids sometimes went to smoke cigarettes, the hidden paths through Hoover Forest Preserve, the abandoned farmhouse on Miller Road where couples sometimes went to be alone. "We walked through every inch of those woods," Jennifer recalled years later. "We called Laura's name until our voices were hoarse. We were convinced that if we just looked hard enough, we would find her." The first week of July brought no answers, only more questions. Laura's Honda Civic yielded no useful evidence beyond confirmation that she had driven it to town after leaving the lake. Her purse contained her wallet, driver's license, and $17 in cash, ruling out robbery as a motive. The car showed no signs of struggle, no damage that might indicate an accident. Detective Sawyer interviewed Richard Hale, the son of a local factory owner who had attended the bonfire that Friday night. Richard was a year older than Laura, a popular athlete who had graduated from Yorkville High in 1985 and was working at his father's manufacturing plant while deciding whether to attend college. He told Sawyer that he had spoken with Laura briefly at the bonfire, but had left before she did. "She seemed fine when I saw her," Richard said during his interview. "Just hanging out with her friends, nothing unusual. I left around 10 o'clock to get home for curfew." Sawyer made a note of the timeline, but found nothing suspicious about Richard's account. The young man came from a respected family, had no criminal record, and his story aligned with what other witnesses had reported. As July stretched into August, the daily searches began to lose their initial urgency. Volunteers still showed up, but in smaller numbers. The coordination center at the high school was moved to a single classroom. Local newspapers ran fewer stories about the case, and conversations at Mabel's Diner gradually shifted from speculation about Laura's fate to other topics: the drought affecting corn yields, the upcoming county fair, the Chicago Bears, prospects for the upcoming football season. The Jensen family refused to give up hope, but the strain began to show. Jim took a leave of absence from his job at Caterpillar, spending his days driving the back roads of Kendall County, following up on tips that led nowhere. Carol continued working at the dental office, but co-workers noticed how she would stare out the window during her lunch breaks, scanning the parking lot as if Laura might suddenly appear. The hardest part was not knowing, Carol would say years later. If someone had told us she was gone, we could have grieved. If someone had told us she was alive somewhere, we could have hoped. But the silence, that was the worst thing imaginable. Detective Sawyer kept the case active through the fall and winter of 1986, but with no new leads, his attention was inevitably drawn to other matters. The Kendall County Sheriff's Department was a small operation with limited resources, and missing person cases without evidence of foul play typically received lower priority as time passed. By the spring of 1987, the search for Laura Jensen had effectively ended. Her case file remained open, stored in a filing cabinet at the Sheriff's Department, alongside dozens of other unsolved cases from over the years. The reward fund established by her parents had grown to $5,000, but no one came forward with credible information. Life in Yorkville gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though Laura's absence left a permanent mark on the community. The high school dedicated a bench in her memory, placed in the courtyard where students ate lunch. Her parents continued to place missing person flyers in store windows along Main Street, even as the paper yellowed and the edges curled from exposure to sunlight. The annual 4th of July fireworks at Hoover Forest Preserve took on a different character after 1986. Families still gathered on blankets to watch the display, but conversations were more subdued, and parents kept closer watch on their teenagers. Laura Jensen's disappearance had shattered the illusion that nothing bad could happen in a place like Yorkville. Yorkville, Illinois, March 2025. Mary Ann Tully adjusted her reading glasses and squinted at the dusty cardboard box sitting on the metal table in the basement of the Kendall County Historical Society. At 73 years old, she had been volunteering at the Historical Society for nearly a decade, helping to digitize the community's photographic archives before the old negatives deteriorated beyond recovery. The basement smelled of old paper and developing chemicals, a scent that reminded her of her late husband's darkroom from 40 years earlier. The box she was examining had been donated by the estate of Robert Morrison, a longtime Yorkville resident who had passed away the previous winter. Morrison's family had cleared out his house on Maple Street, donating several boxes of photographs, documents, and memorabilia to the Historical Society before putting the property up for sale. "So most of this stuff is probably just family snapshots," Mary Ann muttered to herself as she lifted out plastic containers filled with undeveloped film canisters. But you never know what you might find. She had been working through the Morrison collection for 3 weeks, discovering a treasure trove of Yorkville history, photographs from the town's centennial celebration in 1976, images of the old railroad depot before it was demolished, candid shots of long-forgotten businesses along Main Street. Each roll of film was like opening a time capsule, revealing moments that had been frozen in silver halide crystals for decades. The canister that would change everything was labeled in faded ink, Rick's Film Summer, 86. Mary Ann noted that Rick was Robert Morrison's son, who had moved to Phoenix in the early 1990s and had been killed in a car accident in 2003. She had known Rick Morrison when he was a teenager, remembered him as a popular boy who had graduated from Yorkville High around the same time as that poor Jensen girl who had disappeared. Using the digital scanner that the Historical Society had purchased with a grant from the state of Illinois, Mary Ann carefully processed the 36 exposures on the roll. Most of the images were exactly what she had expected. Teenagers at what appeared to be a graduation party, young people posed around a bonfire, candid shots of friends laughing and talking. The photographs had the casual, unposed quality of an era before digital cameras and social media made every moment feel curated. But it was frame number 23 that made Mary Ann's breath catch in her throat. The image showed a group of 6 teenagers sitting on logs around a campfire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. She recognized several of them as former Yorkville High students, now middle-aged adults living throughout the Chicago suburbs. And there, sitting between Jennifer Walsh and Tommy Burke, was a blonde girl wearing a Yorkville High t-shirt, her face clearly visible in the firelight. Mary Ann had been living in Yorkville in 1986. She remembered the massive search effort, the yellow ribbons that had appeared on trees throughout the town, the way Laura Jensen's disappearance had cast a shadow over the entire community. And now, nearly 40 years later, she was looking at what appeared to be one of the last photographs ever taken of the missing girl. But it wasn't just Laura's presence in the photograph that made Mary Ann's hands tremble as she held the printed image. It was what she could see in the background, partially obscured by shadows but unmistakably there, a figure standing behind the seated group, someone who hadn't been part of the main composition but had been caught by the camera's lens nonetheless. Mary Ann could make out the silhouette of a man, tall and athletic, wearing what appeared to be a letter jacket. His hand was clearly visible, resting on Laura's shoulder in a gesture that could have been interpreted as casual friendship or something more possessive. And on that hand, even in the grainy enlargement that Mary Ann had printed, she could see the glint of what appeared to be a class ring. She spent the next 2 hours examining the photograph under different lighting conditions, using a magnifying glass to study every detail. The figure in the background was definitely male, definitely someone who had been present at the bonfire on the night Laura Jensen was last seen alive. And while his face was partially obscured by shadows, there was something familiar about his profile, something that tugged at Mary Ann's memory. The next morning, Mary Ann drove to the Kendall County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with someone about the Laura Jensen case. The desk sergeant, a young man who couldn't have been born when Laura disappeared, looked at her with polite skepticism until she produced the photograph. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to speak with Detective Sanders," he said after examining the image. "He's retired, but he still consults on cold cases. This is significant." Detective Eli Sanders was 71 years old and had been retired from active duty for 6 years, but he still maintained an office at the Sheriff's Department and continued to work on unsolved cases that had haunted him throughout his career. The Laura Jensen disappearance was at the top of that list. He had inherited the case from Detective Sawyer in 1995 and had spent the next 20 years following up on tips, re-interviewing witnesses, and searching for new evidence. When Mary Ann Tully walked into his office carrying the photograph, Sanders felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a potential breakthrough. He had seen thousands of photographs during his career, but he possessed the kind of attention to detail that separated good detectives from great ones. "Tell me about the ring," Sanders said after studying the image for several minutes. "I noticed it too," Mary Ann replied. "It's definitely a class ring, and it looks like there might be initials or an inscription on it." Sanders used a high-powered magnifying glass to examine the photograph, focusing on the hand resting on Laura's shoulder. The ring was clearly visible, and while the inscription wasn't completely legible, he could make out what appeared to be the letters RH, followed by what looked like 85. Sanders walked to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder that contained every piece of evidence related to the Laura Jensen case. Near the back of the file, he found what he was looking for: a list of everyone who had been interviewed in connection with Laura's disappearance, cross-referenced with their ages and graduation years. Richard Hale graduated Yorkville High School in 1985. Son of Harold Hale, owner of Hale Manufacturing, had been present at the bonfire on June 27, 1986, but had told investigators that he left before Laura did. Sanders felt the pieces beginning to align in his mind, the way they did when a cold case finally started to crack open. He had learned to trust that feeling over the decades, the sensation that came when disparate facts suddenly formed a coherent pattern. "Mary Ann," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm going to need you to keep this photograph confidential for now. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, understanding instinctively that she had stumbled onto something significant. Sanders spent the rest of that day reviewing every piece of evidence in the Laura Jensen file, looking for any mention of Richard Hale that might have been overlooked during the original investigation. What he found was a thin thread of connection that had been deemed insignificant in 1986, but now seemed potentially crucial. Richard Hale's family had owned property near Silver Lake, including a small boathouse that had been demolished in 1987. The timing of the demolition, just 8 months after Laura's disappearance, had never been investigated as potentially significant. It was time to take another look at Richard Hale. Yorkville, Illinois, April 2025. Richard Hale's suburban split-level house in Madison, Wisconsin, sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by the kind of mature oak trees that suggested the neighborhood had been established decades earlier. At 58 years old, he had lived there for nearly 30 years, building a successful career as a regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, reliable man who kept his lawn meticulously maintained and always brought his garbage cans in from the curb before noon on collection day. Detective Eli Sanders had spent 2 weeks preparing for this conversation, reviewing every detail of the original investigation and consulting with the current sheriff's department about the best approach to take. The photograph from the bonfire had provided new evidence, but it wasn't enough to justify an arrest warrant. Sanders needed Richard Hale to talk, to fill in the gaps that had remained empty for 39 years. When Sanders knocked on Hale's front door on a grey Thursday morning in April, he was accompanied by Detective Lisa Chen from the Wisconsin State Police, who had agreed to assist with the interview as a professional courtesy. Sanders had requested local support partly for jurisdictional reasons, but mostly because he wanted a witness to whatever Richard Hale might say. Hale answered the door wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt, the uniform of suburban middle management. Sanders noticed that he had aged well, maintaining the athletic build that had made him a standout basketball player at Yorkville High School. His hair had gone grey at the temples, and he wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly appearance. "Mr. Hale, I'm Detective Sanders from the Kendall County Sheriff's Department in Illinois. I wonder if we could have a few minutes of your time to discuss a case we're working on." Sanders watched Hale's face carefully as he introduced himself and Detective Chen. There was a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or concern, that crossed Hale's features before he regained his composure. "Of course," Hale said, stepping aside to allow the detectives into his living room. "Though I'm not sure how I could help with anything happening in Illinois these days." The living room was neat and sparsely decorated, with framed photographs on the mantelpiece showing Hale at various company events and fishing trips. Sanders noted the absence of family photographs. No wife, no children, no evidence of the kind of personal relationships that typically anchored a man's life in his late 50s. "We're investigating the disappearance of Laura Jensen from Yorkville in 1986, Sanders said, settling into a leather recliner across from Hale. "I believe you were interviewed about that case at the time." "Laura Jensen," Hale repeated, as if the name required effort to recall. "Yes, that was a terrible thing. I remember being questioned about it, but I didn't have much information to offer. I knew her from school, of course, but we weren't particularly close." Sanders produced a manila folder containing copies of the original interview reports from 1986. "According to these records, you told investigators that you attended a bonfire at Silver Lake on the night Laura disappeared, but that you left before she did." "That sounds right," Hale said. "It was almost 40 years ago, so the details are a bit fuzzy, but I remember leaving early that night." Detective Chen pulled out the newly discovered photograph and placed it on the coffee table between them. "We recently came across this image from that same bonfire, Mr. Hale. Could you take a look at it for us?" Sanders watched Hale's face as he examined the photograph. The man's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sanders noticed that his hands tightened slightly as he held the image. "I can see myself in the background there," Hale said after a moment. "Like I said, I was at the bonfire that night." "Can you tell us about the ring you're wearing in the photograph?" Sanders asked. Hale glanced down at his left hand, which now bore only a simple gold wedding band. "My class ring, I suppose. I probably wore it all the time back then." "The ring appears to have your initials on it," Detective Chen observed. "RH85. Is that correct?" "Yes, that would be right. Richard Hale, class of 1985. Sanders leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hale, the photograph shows your hand on Laura Jensen's shoulder. Can you tell us about your relationship with her?" For the first time since the interview began, Hale's composure showed signs of strain. He set the photograph down on the coffee table and removed his glasses, cleaning the lenses with unnecessary care. "We were friends, I suppose. Yorkville was a small town, everyone knew everyone else." "Just friends," Sanders pressed gently. Hale replaced his glasses and met Sanders' gaze directly. "Detective, so I answered these same questions 39 years ago. Laura Jensen disappeared, and it was a tragedy for everyone who knew her, but I had nothing to do with what happened to her." The interview continued for another hour, with Sanders and Chen methodically working through the timeline of that night in June 1986. Hale's answers remained consistent with his original statement, but Sanders detected subtle inconsistencies that hadn't been apparent during the initial investigation. Small details about timing, about who had been present at the bonfire, about the route Hale had taken when leaving the lake. After the detectives left, Sanders spent the drive back to Illinois thinking about what he had observed during the interview. Richard Hale had been cooperative but not forthcoming, careful but not completely convincing. Most significantly, he had failed to ask the question that innocent people typically asked when questioned about old cases: whether there had been any new developments in the investigation. Back in Yorkville, Sanders met with the current sheriff, Robert Martinez, to discuss the next steps in the investigation. The photograph provided new evidence, but it wasn't sufficient to support criminal charges. They needed more, ideally, physical evidence that could link Richard Hale to Laura Jensen's disappearance. What about the property his family owned near the lake? Martinez suggested. You mentioned that they demolished a boathouse in 1987. Sanders pulled out a yellowed property survey from the case file. The Hale family had owned a 5-acre parcel on the north shore of Silver Lake, including a small cottage and an outbuilding that the survey identified as a boathouse. The property had been sold in 1988, and the current owners had built a larger house on the site. It's worth taking a look, Sanders agreed. If we can get permission from the current property owners, we could bring in ground-penetrating radar, see if there's anything unusual about the area where the boathouse used to stand. The radar survey was conducted on a crisp morning in May 2025, with technicians from the Illinois State Police Crime Lab operating equipment that could detect subsurface anomalies. Sanders watched from a distance as the operators methodically scanned the area where property records indicated the old boathouse had been located. The first anomaly appeared on the radar screen around 10 o'clock that morning. The technician, a woman named Dr. Patricia Ewan, who had been analyzing ground-penetrating radar data for 15 years, called Sanders over to examine the readout. "Yes, there's definitely something here," she said, pointing to a dark shadow on the radar display. "Something that doesn't match the surrounding soil composition. It's about 6 feet down, roughly rectangular in shape." Sanders felt his pulse quicken. "How big?" "Approximately 6 feet by 3 feet, Dr. Ewan replied. "The right size and shape to be human remains." The excavation began that afternoon with a careful archaeological approach that would preserve any evidence that might be present. Sanders supervised the dig personally, along with Dr. Sarah Hoffman from the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office, who had been brought in to handle any human remains that might be discovered. At a depth of 5 feet and 8 inches, the excavation team uncovered a piece of deteriorated fabric. Continuing carefully, they revealed what appeared to be the skeletal remains of a young person, along with several personal items that had survived nearly 4 decades in the ground. Dr. Hoffman worked with painstaking precision to document the position of the remains and collect every piece of evidence. Among the items recovered were a tarnished silver necklace with a pendant bearing the initials L, JD, and the deteriorated remains of what appeared to be a Yorkville High School t-shirt. DNA analysis would be required to confirm the identity of the remains, but Sanders had no doubt about what they had found. After 39 years, Laura Jensen was finally coming home. The arrest warrant for Richard Hale was issued 3 weeks later, after DNA testing confirmed that the remains belonged to Laura Jensen, and forensic analysis of soil samples from Hale's shoes, preserved in police evidence storage since 1986, matched the mineral composition of the area around the burial site. Hale was arrested at his home in Madison on a Tuesday morning in June 2025, exactly 39 years and 1 week after Laura Jensen had disappeared. Detective Chen handled the arrest, reading Hale his rights in the same living room where Sanders had interviewed him 2 months earlier. The confession came slowly, delivered in fragments over 3 days of interrogation at the Kendall County Sheriff's Department. Hale admitted to having had a romantic relationship with Laura Jensen that she had wanted to end. He acknowledged that they had argued at the bonfire on the night she disappeared, and that he had followed her when she left to go home. She said she was going to college in the fall, and she didn't want to be tied down to someone who wasn't going anywhere, Hale told investigators. She said I was just a small-town guy who would never amount to anything. According to Hale's statement, the argument had escalated when he confronted Laura in the parking lot of Henderson's Hardware, where she had stopped to use the payphone to call a friend. The confrontation had turned physical, and Laura had fallen, striking her head on the concrete curb. Hale claimed that her death had been accidental, the result of a push rather than a deliberate blow. "I panicked," Hale said during his final interview. "I knew no one would believe it was an accident. My family had influence in the town, and I knew people would think I had gotten away with murder because of who my father was." With his father's help, Hale had buried Laura's body beneath the boathouse on the family property, then demolished the structure 8 months later to further conceal the grave. The secret had remained buried for nearly 4 decades, shared only between father and son until Harold Hale's death in 2003. But even as Richard Hale signed his confession, Sanders remained troubled by inconsistencies in the story. The forensic evidence suggested that Laura had been struck multiple times, not once as Hale claimed. The positioning of her body in the grave indicated careful burial, not the hasty concealment that might be expected from someone in a panic. Most troubling of all, footprint analysis of the burial site had revealed evidence of at least 2 different people present during the interment. Hale's confession accounted for only one set of those prints. As Sanders stood in the cemetery on a grey October morning, watching Laura Jensen's remains being laid to rest in the Yorkville Cemetery, he thought about the nature of truth and the weight of secrets. The case was officially closed. Richard Hale had been sentenced to 25 years in prison, and the Jensen family had finally received the answers they had sought for nearly 4 decades. But Sanders knew, with the instinct that had guided him through 30 years of investigations, that some secrets were still buried beneath the surface of Yorkville's quiet streets. The confession had solved the mystery of Laura Jensen's disappearance, but it had also raised new questions about the lengths that some people would go to protect their own. In his final report on the case, Sanders wrote, "The physical evidence confirms that Laura Jensen died on the night of June 27, 1986, and that her remains were buried on property belonging to the Hale family. Richard Hale's confession provides a plausible account of the events leading to her death. However, certain aspects of the forensic evidence suggest that the full truth of what happened that night may never be known." The case file was marked "Closed by Confession" and placed in the archive room of the Kendall County Sheriff's Department, joining thousands of other cases that had been resolved over the decades. But Sanders kept a copy of the photograph that had broken the case open, the image of young people gathered around a bonfire on a summer night in 1986, their faces bright with the promise of futures that some of them would never see. In small towns like Yorkville, memories fade and secrets get buried deep. But photographs, Sanders had learned, never forget who was standing in the frame. And sometimes, after decades of silence, they find a way to speak the truth that the living have been afraid to tell.